All right. So let's finish talking about power. And then also I'll try to slide into conflict for whatever time I have. Before I go on, I usually like to recommend books to my students. I think these are two excellent books that you might want to consider. Influenced by Cialdini. He is a practitioner. He is not an academician, but every academician knows him because he writes some very interesting things. This is a book on leadership psychology and leadership in organizations. You can find this book for $15 anywhere. And I wish I would have had this as my first course instead of being the very last course I ever took. I took a master's in leadership psychology and I went, wow, what a great class. So I would recommend this book too if you aspire to leadership. It will help you understand. Sometimes the worst thing about leaders is we're confused. Where are they going? This helps you understand the mind of a leader, which is pretty fascinating. Okay. So moving on to channel power, we talked about the 5 sources of power. We talked about grouping them together, and now we're going to talk about the flip side, which is dependence. So what gives power its power, for a lack of a better word? Where does it get its strength? Why do some individuals have power over the individuals? Well, this is the reason, and it is known as dependence. Dependence says that we recognize that B, for some reason or another, depends more heavily on A. And what are the 2 rules? You could actually number this number 1 and number 2. Is when one side obtains a greater utility, value, benefits, satisfaction, enjoyment from A. I have a dependence. And then the other part of that is there alternatives for that particular thing that you receive? And so once again, we have one of those silly formulas where dependence equals the utility, the value, times the alternative scarcity. And when we know this about multiplication, if this number is a 0, what is this whole equation? When you multiply a 0, what do you get?
0.
Thank you. Yes, you did. And that's what this means, is that if I get no utility whatsoever out of the relationship, or it is plentiful, I can get it anywhere, then the answer is that there's no dependence. And so the actors in the situation, the 2 individual corporations as they're balanced, we have to think of the power and their dependence because it helps us to understand also scarcity, how readily B can be replaced today. Well, in the modern world right now, the power is based in the distributors and the retailers because there are so many manufacturers now, because the world is one place now. And so manufacturing can be done practically anywhere. Now, there are things that are dynamically changing, such as things like 3D printing, nearshoring, and other things that is reducing dependence. But then again, it's just one of those situations. So how do you measure dependence? What is the ways that you can say, well, let me put a number to this? So the one way you do it is think of yourself as one of the actors, and you act on another corporation. How dependent are they on me? How does your offering help them meet their pursuits? And that's why it's important to understand their goals. The reason that we study consumers is that we want to know what they need in order to achieve. And if we can provide that, then that's a valued service that people will want again and again. And that's the same thing in channels. So what is that unique idiosyncratic benefit that we give that can't be replaced? And then with that, are there any potential competitors? And how easy is it for the one organization to switch from another to another? Cell phones and contracts and all of those other things always go through this difficulty. Anything that requires a subscription service and finding the perfect subscription model is darn near impossible. So if you look at this, the combined analysis of both of them will ultimately give you some kind of an idea of the dependence on you and also give you an idea of your own personal level of power. Now, the one thing about power is that power tends to be difficult to be able to come up with a firm dollar and cents. So if I'm going to measure dependence, one of the ways is what is my percentage of their sales or profits? Procter & Gamble is something like 17% of Walmart's profits. So that kind of a myth, give you an idea. When Walmart's making $650 billion a year, kind of gives you an idea where P&G stands with them. Doesn't capture the benefits, but it does access scarcity. What would it be like for a big vacuum like that to go out? Sometimes if the market is good and it's growing, it doesn't matter because a rising tide lifts all boats and everybody does well. But in times of scarcity and uncertainty, not so much. How well do we perform our roles? We are all actors. And we're all living in a certain play. And we, through our own norms and the ways in which we live, we all perform roles. How much of that role performance is unique? Even for a commodity product. Somebody name me a banana. Chiquita. Isn't it amazing you said the brand and not the type? And that's one of the ways that you can measure, how superior it is. The brand identifies the way it's called a Cavendish. We ate more Cavendish bananas. I think like 40% of all the bananas we eat. So you learn something new. Okay. So what is unique? Even for a commodity product, bananas, it's a commodity. But there's a way of making it unique. And then finally, we just use the 5 sources: reward, coercion, legal logistic, traditional logistic, reference, and expert. And so the extent that the change varies in the level of dependence on the influencer gives us an idea. And so these are the ways that we look at dependence. And we try to find measuring sticks for something that's literally unmeasurable. I think the percentage of sales is probably the most obvious one. It doesn't capture, like I said, the esoteric satisfactions, but at least gives you a dollar number to work from. So, what does this all add up to? One of my teachers who just retired, Bruce Alford, used to, when he would talk about marketing, he would say, basically, you just got to understand, it's just people. All organizations are people, all right? And people are the ones that drive the relationships. And so power is not the property of the organization, it's the property of the relationships who work within it. And it kind of gives you an idea what organizations have to understand is that each employee, and I'm sure they do, but they are the organization. They represent everything that you're supposed to be. But remember, the power may be only in relationship to X, and this is when people leave organizations where you really see difficulties. Just remember that dependence is never one way. And that high mutual dependence is synonymous with high mutual power. Asymmetric power rarely works. I'm gonna go get my chair. So a balance or an imbalance of dependence can be very dangerous because it can really lead to exploitation. Realize us also is the weaker member in an imbalanced may suffer worse than anyone else because of that imbalance as well. And I'm sure we've all been in asymmetric relationships, and it is very difficult to be trusting. Very difficult. Weaknesses, unfortunately, are a corrosion. And so how do you balance that dependence? What are the ways? So let's say the stronger party in one way or another preys upon the weaker party. Let's say that they ask or request of them things that simply will not allow them to go on. And so what are the most common ways that they can strike back? And so the first is that A can develop alternatives for B, which is the most common. Find something else that will provide that particular utility that may not be able to generate all the revenue, but something or enough. And so you see with the glut of 4K televisions right now, you see other off brands that are coming in and they're willing to accept that they'll carry the flagship brands, but they're not able to really make as much money. But the alternative brands, they can make a reasonable income. Many automobile dealers will have multiple locations with different brands. Once again, that also kinds of spreads out the dependence. It's not surprising that modern Toyota also owns a modern Subaru and modern Jeep and modern Ford. The reason that is you just spread out the load. You're doing something a very unique kind of strength and you play into, and you do more than one dealership. Once again, multi-unit franchising is the way that you achieve success. And this is the very same reason is they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket like Chrysler and have Chrysler pull the rug out from under them like they have done, which is no Chrysler anymore. The next is that you can organize a coalition to attack A. So go back to the automobile industry. Back in the 50s, after World War II, the great expansion after that, one of the things that automobile manufacturers wanted to do is do away with the franchise system, do away with the dealerships and go to a fully integrated system. Has a lot of advantages that way. They could be able to maximize the benefits of their profit, maximize the benefits long term. But the dealerships, rightly so, said we helped create these brands. We service these brands. We provide them value. We're not going away. And so what happened is this coalition of dealers got together, demanded they reverse the strategy and did. Callaway golf clubs I've talked about before were about to go online, and the pro shops where Callaway was doing most of its work from erupted for the very same reason. And so this is one of the ways, but it has to be a coalition. In unity, there's strength. One isn't going to do it. There has to be some majority movement. And then the final thing is you can just get out. Just withdraw entirely from the business and therefore completely from the relationship. LG Electronics was my favorite cell phone, but they got out of the business in 2019 quite simply because too much to do and not enough time to do it. And they basically gave that up to Samsung, which I understand. But while they were doing it, they were pretty good phones. Okay, so these are the three. So how do you tolerate imbalance dependence? Well, most of the time you accept it. The dependent party just says that this is the way it is, and I'm just going to have to make the best of it. Or, you rely on internal norms. There's a certain way that you want to go, and these are the attitudes that you would have. So in a predictable market where everything is fine, and I'm not making a lot of money on this particular line, well, the norm or the way of thinking is, well, it takes care of things. I'm making money. I'm not hurting. I have a predictable demand. I can minimize the need on price reductions. I just run that and keep it running, and I'm okay with it. I'll live with limited success versus none at all. And so that's what a predictable market would say. In an uncertain market, this is where high mutual dependence is very important, because you've got to make sure there's a lot of complex situations going on. And hopefully what you have is buyers and sellers and suppliers are going to find some common ground to be able to get along together. And so that's the way you need to think of it in an uncertain market. But even though power imbalance exists, and the only equal to Walmart of Walmart's partners has got to be Procter and Gamble. I can't think of anyone else that's equal to them. And yet there are thousands of vendors that work through the Walmart system, and you're just fine with it, because basically you get to play in the big house. This is why Amazon does so well as well. You get to play on the big stage. And so we have all these ways of having power. How do we actually express them? How do we communicate power in a way? Now, this is one of those ideas that I want you to kind of get comfortable with, along with conflict, because really in situations like this, it's understanding the best and most effective way of doing these things are many times the reason that you're going to succeed or not. So see if you can think of these ideas and put them in your own words and think about these strategies. So realize how important it is to communicate. I say it, one of the things that I do especially is with the position papers is I want you to learn to write well and remember to speak well. Your ability to communicate your ideas may be your most important factor, all right? So realize that the way you communicate influences your channel relationships. And one of the things that Cialdini talks about, several of these ways of influencing, these are the expressive ways in which you try to communicate these things. And so we're going to run through these one at a time. We'll talk about each one. So the first is a promise. A promise basically says, do what we wish and we will reward you. And that is, of course, reward power. This is your way of expressing it. Now, we can change that through changing the valence of that and making it contingent or non-contingent. I'm getting ahead. But basically, this is the essence of what it is. The next is the threat. Okay? And that is coercion. And as I've talked about, this is the last resort. If you don't do what we wish, we'll punish you. We will remove something that you have. It's a last resort, but it's there in case you need it. Legalistic. And this, of course, is this is traditional legal, and legal logistic. All right. So logistically, basically, it goes through two communications. Do what we wish because you have agreed to. It is a societal norm, even if I shake your hand, and that's all. Society says you should fulfill your obligations. That's traditional logistic. Legal logistics says we signed a contract, and my expectation is that this is going to be delivered at such and such a date. That's legal. So you've got both sides, one by society norms and the others by contract. The next is request, which kind of doesn't really fit anywhere. And I would almost think of it as probably a little referent. You respect that person who's ever asking. And it sounds so silly. Please, you're always supposed to say please. Well, guess what? One of the things that Cialdini says in Influencing is sometimes only making the request is all you need to do. It's like in sales, ask for the order. Close, all right? So he did this experiment where he did 120 people who were at a copier, and someone would come in and say, I need to make copies. Can I go ahead of you? And 80% of the time, people said, yeah, go right ahead, all right? Sometimes just making the request. And if they asked what you've got to do, they would say, well, I'm making copies. That's all they had to say. So sometimes just asking is enough, okay? So the next is information exchange. So information exchange is basically a direction of discussion that leads individuals down a certain road, which ultimately at the very end means that if you agree with everything they say, then the most logical conclusion is go with it, all right? This is also called a barrier selling technique. The classic example is, do you want to take care of your children? Sure. Where the answer is always going to be yes. Don't you think they need to be provided in their later years? Well, the answer is yes. You build a series of yeses, and then you say, if you sign on the bottom line and you put 10% of your income in every year, you're guaranteed to do it. All right. That's what information exchange does. Information exchange is a connection with this is both referent and expert power, or F-E-R-E-N-T. Having a problem. Anyway, referent and expert. And I would also say the very last one, which is recommendation, is the same thing. The problem with the recommendation is you're the one who comes up with the conclusion instead of the other individual, all right? So in the information exchange, you're gliding or you're getting the person to go down a particular discussion and eventually to get them to the place where you expect them to give you the answer. The recommendation says, this is ours, we're telling you what to do. And the problem with that, of course, is that especially if it's an entrepreneur, they don't like to be told anything, all right? They don't even like to be told what time of day it is. So there's some situations that just simply a recommendation. Now, so with my mother, she was one of those individuals who I could never tell a thing to. In other words, Mom, you got to do this. The only way that you could do it is give her the facts, and then about 15 minutes later, she'll agree. My daughters are the same way, all right? So it's all about how you communicate. So what are some of the effectiveness? So just realize that a promise and the threat and legalistic promote backlash. Even in a promise, okay? Because nobody likes to be held to a promise. So the request and the information exchange and the recommendation strategies are subtle and nuanced, and they're also very culturally based as well. In Western societies and Western civilizations, we believe conversation is the way that you drive decisions. In other countries, not so much, all right? The cultures are driven in different ways, all right? To me, the best of all strategy is winner take all to me. If you got the reason why and you're better, I don't believe in compromising. Let's go winner take all, okay? So in Western countries, a suggestion from another culture could be equal to a sock in the jaw. Sometimes cultures are not, I would not say rude, but maybe overly honest. I find Scandinavian cultures, I've learned to get a very healthy hide, thank you, Yeah, I did gain weight, didn't I? I looked that bad, huh? Okay, anyway. So anyway, folks, learn to take things with a grain of salt. Culture will kill you if you're not careful. So anyway, coercive culture in one culture may be legitimate power in another. Just take everything with a grain of salt, and when you're in Rome, shoot Roman candles. Okay. So anyway, come on. So valence as a word means the pleasantness or unpleasantness of a situation. And it's a very interesting word. I mean, pleasant, when you think about it, and I'm kind of a wordsmith, I love words. It really kind of says it. It's like, it's a pleasurable kind of situation or unpleasurable, all right? And so how you frame the question, and this is what we were talking about using these powers, how we frame it goes a long way to our effectiveness. So if I take a positive valence, I make it pleasant. I can say, if you take on our product, you'll get substantial marketing support. That is making it more pleasant. The negative side and the flip side is, if you don't take it, you won't receive it. Not the best idea. But you can use it as a last closer, the very last thing you say before you give up. And that would be its best and most effective way. Or how do we condition this? Is this a quid pro quo or not? In other words, is there an expectation of doing this contingent? And how do we frame that? So in between my two daughters and raising them, there's two ways that I can respond or try to get them to do good acts. The contingent act says, if you clean your room, we'll keep going to Panero's on Wednesday and then the sweet roll. Okay. That would be contingent. If you take on this product, we will give you the Distributor of the Year award. I don't like that. Okay. I look for my daughters to do random acts of kindness and then I reward them because I think that's more substantial. One of the ways builds patterns, which is good, but another one promotes decency. All right. And that's the way I feel. So when my daughters do something great, hey, congratulations. How about sweet roll? That's the difference. Okay. And they all work. It just depends if they work with you as an individual. So you have to kind of frame these ideas and put them in your head and see what's the best way to make them work. So we are ending this chapter. We're going to start a little bit on conflict, but just to end this chapter, power is the ability to alter another organization's behavior. All right. It is not changing attitudes because you can't change people's attitudes. you can change their behavior. In order to translate power, you must communicate power. You have to be careful about negative or contingent framing. They're usually inferior to positive or non-contingent. And remember, interdependence makes the power a critical factor. Interdependence, the need for us to help each other. All right. So, conflict. So, one of the great conflicts in the United States in sports had to do with baseball. We'll talk about more later. In this, before 1968-69, a baseball team owned the professional career of the athletes that played for them. They could trade them, they could move them, they negotiated contracts, but those baseball players could not go anywhere. There was a individual by the name of Curt Flood, 1968-69, who was a player for the St. Louis Cardinals who thought that, well, it's worth my career, and filed free agency against Major League Baseball. It did take his career 5 years, 1974, but he had a complete victory. All right. Of what we know now, he fundamentally changed not just baseball, but everything that has to do with sports, and also the concepts. Does an athlete own the value of his effort, which they certainly do, like any artist would. It was without this conflict, we would not be where we are. And so one of the things that I want to do when I point out conflict is also say that conflict can be good. It doesn't mean that it's helpful sometimes, but sometimes it can be good. And so, what is conflict? Conflict comes from the Latin word confligere, which means to collide. Conflict is a natural state of opposition or discord with members in the marketing channel. Discord can be good, discord can be bad. Remember my chapter 10 discussion. Just remember, it is a tool. Certain amount of conflict is desirable. You know, organizations need to turn the soil over a little bit, expose the roots, and be able to see young and fresh. Conflict arises when one member views the upstream or downstream partner as an adversary or in opposition to them, as an opponent. And it can be a pretty bad situation. And this is why dual distribution, you know, by its very nature, okay, when we talk about it, you know, the impartiality is gone. It's different from competition, which refers to behavior where the member seeks a goal. It's not competition. This is conflict. And so, definition for the test is the behavior by a channel member that is in opposition to the wishes or behaviors of its channel counterpart. Guys, I hope you don't do that. It's not going to make it easier on me. And they do it. And so, not all conflict is alike. Otherwise, you couldn't have conflict that is good and conflict is bad. So not all conflict is the same. And so that's where influence and leadership takes over. And so what I'm going to introduce to you is the 4 states of conflict or types. Now, it kind of puts this in a circle. I want you to note this is not actually the way it should. It goes from latent to perceived to felt to manifest. So this slide's wrong. Just remember, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to describe them to you, each one of these. We'll talk about them one at a time. So latent conflict. Oops, sorry. Latent conflict is basically when the channel members are simply going about their own business, competing for limited resources, just know that they exist out there. They're pursuing their separate goals, and it just happens to be competition out there. Usually you would ignore it. It would just disappear. It's not there. It exists, but not on a visceral level. Perceived conflict is recognize that opposition with your channel member exists. There's an opposition in your viewpoint, your intentions. It tends to be cognitive. It is emotionless. It is just a recognition that there's some conflict there. Yeah, I know you go to Walmart at 9 and make it hard for me to get my shipments out by 3, but I guess I'll just live with it. Felt conflict is an affective, A-F-F-E-C-T, affective state. That is an emotion. Emotions, by the way, folks, are evaluations of stimuli. So think of an emotion, actually, it might be a reactive state, but it is in the culmination of your perceptions. And so you perceive anxiety, you have anger and frustration. There's a hostility that is brewing through the interactions, and it starts to take on a more visceral state. Members also start to personalize their differences. Those guys over there, they're awful. You know, they've got that one guy over there, it's bad. It becomes spoken, and then finally manifest is where one tries to sabotage the other. This is visibly through behaviors, okay? Just as you can, with power, change behavior for good, through conflict, you can also change it for bad. You withdraw support. You actively block the other organization's success. All of those things. It is a contentious situation that not only that, but it leapfrogs organizational memory to other individuals in the group. Welcome into our organization. Look, you only use this particular person if it's a last resort. They're awful. Okay, that would be an example. Conflict is a state, but it's also a process. Okay, so it is both of these things. It is a snapshot in a moment in time that you can assess the level, but it's also a process that eventually you can abate through good techniques. So 30 years ago, I was playing basketball in church league, and they had this one other guy on the team. We could not beat him, and I really didn't like it. And then in Christmas, he asked to play on our team because the other guys kicked him out, and I said, sure. And we won 2 championships with him. Always give your enemy a chance to be your friend. That's my vote, okay? You know what? I'll tell you what, let's vote on that. That's as far as I want to go anyway. We will finish up conflict on Tuesday, and that'll be the last day before Thanksgiving, and expect 4 inches of snow for my daughter. Have a good weekend.